Okay, I think we start now. So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce Professor Siddharth Natarajan. Siddharth has obtained a doctoral degree from National University of Singapore in Strategy and Policy. And at present, he is Assistant Professor in the Department of Management at Chinese University of Hong Kong Business School. His research focuses on dynamics of business expansion, particularly in evolution of firms' resources, capabilities, products, and markets. His interest also underlies in mobile industry, fintech, and Asian businesses for his empirical research. His domain of interest are in strategic management, entrepreneurship, and global strategy. He teaches various courses in strategy and global management in universities in Singapore as well as in Hong Kong. Siddharth has widely published, so he's way more productive. And he has published in all reputed journals, such as Strategic Management Journal, Organizational Science, and Journal of International Business Studies, JIPS. So undoubtedly, he has a profile to be envied for. So without further ado, I'm very excited to hear about his new project with Pasha and Will, and which is based on the product diversification in 41 Android smartphone vendors in a longitudinal data from 2010 to 2018. Without further ado, welcome Siddharth, and I'm looking forward to your exciting study. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Neha, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm very happy to be here, even though it's virtual. The last time I think it was in 2008 that I happened to be on the IIMA campus, and I have very fond memories there. So I'm very happy to be back and presenting some of my work with the research community here. This project is on the collaborators on this project are Pasha Mahmood from the National University of Singapore and Will Mitchell, who is at the Rotman School at the University of Toronto. All right. The way I plan to speak for around, I understand this is a 1 hour talk, so I'll talk for around 45 minutes. And then that gives us some time for question and answers in the end, if there are any questions. Also, as I was telling Neha, if there are any comments or questions within the presentation, if you have any comments, please do feel free to speak up. You can raise your hand, or I may not be able to see the chat window, but even in case I miss it, just you can just stop me at any time and ask for clarifications. All right. So thank you very much once again. So the main, before I get into this particular paper that I'm going to present right now, I want to make a broader point that understanding the dynamics of business expansion is central to strategy, to strategic management for managers who are running companies, and also for us as researchers in the strategy domain. So, and when I talk about expansion or business expansion, I usually think about, it can be thought about in terms of a firm's activities, a firm's resources, a firm's markets, a firm's products, so on and so forth, right? So today's talk, I will try and provide you some insight about path dependency in product diversification, which is one kind of expansion. Of course, there are different kinds of expansion, but today's talk will be very much focused on trying to give you some sort of insight from what I'm seeing in my work on path dependency. And I'll come to what that is in a moment. But like I said, before getting into the specifics, broadly, I'm very interested, or I'm intrigued by this phenomenon of expansion. So my research has tried to look at expansion across different contexts. And especially since we are at IIMA today, I thought I should just call out one particular thing that I looked at. I studied expansion of ATMs and bank branches in India. And this was also a little bit of I use the demonetization shock in India. So I know many people are interested in this particular phenomenon, and I would love to have a conversation around ATMs and banks in India, especially in the context of demonetization. And what I find there is, demonetization affects the incentives for bank managers for resource allocation in certain ways. And that is short-lived, right? So I just wanted to call that out because, of course, I'm presenting at IIMA today. Beyond that, I've also studied international expansion, this FDI by Japanese MNCs, and capital market development, and during the Asian financial crisis, right? But these contexts are slightly different from the context I'm going to talk of today. Today, I'm going to talk of context which I'm very excited about, partly because I worked in this particular industry before I began research, and that's the global mobile ecosystem. This is a very complex industry. It's a complex ecosystem with different kinds of players. You have mobile devices, you have mobile networks, you have mobile apps, and I have projects that are there, in all these different areas of the global mobile ecosystem, ongoing projects. Today, I'm going to talk about one particular project, and that relates to device vendors, that is smartphone device vendors, and how they diversify their products, right? So that's going to be the focus of today's discussion and today's empirical context. So if you are at all interested in the mobile industry, and if you're thinking about how do these vendors go about expanding their product portfolios, I have some insights to offer for that based on the data that I've collected. Okay, having said that, what product diversification is a very important form of expansion. It's an important strategy for growth, and we know this through research. We also know this through our experience. We look at companies, and often they want to diversify their products, right? It's a very common thing that companies do. And typically in strategy, the way we have looked at this is diversification at the corporate level, and to ask which businesses is a firm present in, and then look at the mix of businesses. So that's a very corporate strategy view of diversification. What I'm going to be talking about is different. So I'm not going to be looking at the corporate strategy view. I'm going to be looking at a diversification more at the business level, where they're in the context of new product development. Because when these companies are making new products, companies have product development teams that whose only job is to create new products and services. They do diversify their product portfolio, right? So I'm going to be looking at new product development, because that's an important aspect of product diversification. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at path dependency within this new product development. And it's important to look at path dependency, because if you think about different companies and how they approach their product development, the trajectory of their product development seems to be very different. So even though companies are competing in the same market, they seem to be developing different products, right? So they seem to have these different trajectories of product development. And then as researchers, the question is why? What drives these differences in the trajectory of product development? So that's going to be the focus of today's discussion. And I'm going to make the point that there is a certain amount of path dependency, and explore that path dependency in a more closely way than what we know today about path dependency. So like I said, the trajectory of product development can vary between firms, right? And so the question is, how does it vary? We can think of new product development from the perspective of the architecture of a product, so that product development can occur within an architecture or across architectures. And I'll explain what I mean by architecture. So the key part here is that if firms are developing new products, these new products can be within a particular architecture or it can be across architectures. So what is an architecture then? I like to think of a product in layman's terms. I like to think of product architecture as the blueprint of a product. Formally, it's known, it's the scheme that allocates the functions of components and specifies the interfaces between components. Because products can be conceptualized as assemblies of components. I mean, you can think of a phone and you can ask, what is a phone? Well, a phone has multiple components, right? And so the phone is really an assembly of different components. Right? And the product architecture defines which components can be used in a phone, how those components interact with each other. So that's the blueprint of a product. And you can think of architecture in different kinds of products. You can think of an architecture in, let's say, a ceiling fan. Now, the architecture of a ceiling fan is very different from the architecture of a portable fan that you carry in your hand. Even though both the ceiling fan and the portable fan, their job is to perhaps, circulate air, right? But the architecturally, they are very different. So now we can start thinking about product development with respect to this particular architecture. Even within a particular architecture, if I give you the blueprint of a product, you will be able to have many new products while sticking to the blueprint of that product. You can think of a company like Samsung, right, that makes smartphones. And Samsung has very different kinds of smartphones. You have smartphones at the premium level. You can have it with lesser features, so on and so forth, but they all belong to the smartphone architecture. So even within an architecture, a company has an opportunity to diversify its product portfolio, right? So that's one way. But the same company, Samsung, you can think of Samsung's diversification and you can ask, what products does it make? And then somebody may say, hey, you know what, Samsung makes smartwatches. Samsung also makes tablets. It makes, these sort of bands. Now, those are fundamentally different architectures, even though they are sometimes known as computing or smart devices. They're architecturally very different from each other and certainly architecturally different from a phone, right? So you have companies that diversify within a given architecture, and you also have these companies that can diversify across architectures. And then we can ask the question, why is it that certain companies seem to diversify within the architecture, whereas some other companies seem to be able to diversify even across architectures? What's the reason? Now, some of these reasons could be strategic, which means that they could be choices by the firm, but it also could be because of certain choices that they've made in the past, which gives rise to path dependence. And we do know from research that the components of a particular product creates a strong path dependency in the way a new product development is carried out. There's a whole bunch of research that talks about the relationships of how existing components, it sort of provides you the base for new product development, right? So you can't really develop, firms usually don't develop products out of the blue. Their existing stock of components, that is the components that they have accumulated over some time, they seem to have an effect on the kind of new products that firms make. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it's also interesting that when a firm makes a new product or commercializes or launches a new product, it also it can trigger a change in its components. So a firm may launch a new product and say, hey, you know what, here's a new product. I see the opportunity for this new component. And then that could lead to new components being, come about. So it's a very co-evolutionary role between components and products. And to distinguish between that, we can think of component stocks at a given point in time, that is the accumulated components at a given point in time, as affecting new product development. And new product development could also affect the new components or the flow of components in the next period of time, right? So there is this sort of relationship that underlies new product development. And we know this through a whole bunch of research. There is evidence to show that both these processes occur, although most research has focused on how component stocks may affect new product development, right? In this paper, we're going to look at both. So it's going to be an integrated model. Now, the key here is when we think of components, these components, even components that fulfill the same function, right? The same function, these components could be in-house or third party. Right? And what do I mean by in-house? In-house means these components are owned by the focal firm making the product, or the component could be owned by someone else outside of the firm, the product vendor. Right? And so you have these differences between in-house and third-party component. And here's the strategic angle. If these in-house and third-party components create opposing path dependencies for in-house, for new product development, it can generate a tension for a firm's product diversification. So is it the case that certain firms have a lot of in-house components and it's creating, it's pushing them in one direction, whereas other firms, do they have third-party components and they go in another direction, right? And asking that question helps us get at the, to understand why we may see differences in diversification, product diversification across firms. So that's the research question in this study. That is, how do in-house, we want to see the comparison between in-house and third-party components and how they affect diversification within and across architectures. Because a firm's product can work with both in-house and third-party components, how does that affect the firm's trajectory of diversification within architectures and across architectures? And so we want to develop some insight, some theory on this. So what's the theoretical reasoning for this? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the theory, and then I will go to the data and the empirics. Right? So the next few slides will be a little bit about the theory of why we may expect in-house components to have particular effects and third-party components to have other kinds of effects. Now, we focus on additive components. This is a particular type of components. These are optional elements that add to the functionality delivered by a product. Simply put, you can think of additive components as not integral to a given product. So you have a mobile phone, right? You have a smartphone, and you have a mobile app. Now, the mobile app is not really an integral part of the phone. The user has an option whether to use an app or not. So that's an additive component. The app sits on top of the phone and it provides greater value to the user of the phone, right? But the choice to whether to use an additive component or not rests with the end user. Right? So we're going to be focusing on these components. Now, to build the theory behind why we may expect these differences, we draw on the interface between knowledge-based theory and transaction cost theory. And very quickly, without getting into too much of detailing in the theories, let me give you the basic intuition. And the basic idea is this, that knowledge-based theory talks about that the knowledge that is gained by the use and the development of existing components, it contributes to the development of product capabilities. So simply put, that if a firm has a lot of experience in developing a particular kind of component, then the firm's capabilities, firm also builds capabilities over time by gaining this knowledge. Right? When we know this from knowledge-based theory. The other aspect of components is the existing components can be used for new products. So there is a potential reuse of components, and the reuse of components has certain economic implications. And to assess the economic implications, we have insights from transaction cost theory. So the transaction cost theory helps us understand What are the implications of using an in-house component in a new product? And what's the implication of using a third-party component in a new product, right? And both these theories put together help us derive certain insights. Importantly, both these theories individually don't really, I mean, they do contribute to our understanding, but they can't we can't arrive at a sharp sort of logic. So the interface between knowledge-based theory and transaction cost theory is really important. In fact, within strategy and management, there has been a lot of emphasis, increasing emphasis on this sort of understanding that theories need not be in opposition to each other. There's a great opportunity to figure out what lies at the interface of these two theories and how they may together jointly build our understanding. So we sort of build on that theoretical base, and there's a strong, there's been some theoretical work on this. We think this is one of the few empirical papers that draws on that base and also extends our understanding of that interface between knowledge-based theory and transaction cost theory. So what is our insight? Our insight is that knowledge-based considerations and these transaction-based considerations will differ for in-house versus third-party additive components. And how may be that the case? One can think of, let's think about the stock of additive components, and you can think of in-house additive components first, and then we'll come to third-party. So when a firm develops in-house additive components, it strengthens the firm's expertise within the existing architecture of the product, because these in-house additive components are meant for a particular product, the particular architecture. And when they develop these components, it strengthens their knowledge, their capabilities in the existing architecture, right? So that gives that sort of they develop their capabilities in a certain way within the existing architecture. Whereas if you think of third-party additive components, by themselves, they don't really contribute to the development of capabilities, but they act as a medium for gaining knowledge, external knowledge. That is knowledge of other architectures outside of the firm. So by engaging with third-party additive components, firms can gain knowledge of different architectures. But if they do it in-house, they're not going to gain that knowledge. So that's a difference from a knowledge-based view. Right? You can also think of it from the perspective of the reuse of components. If a firm is going to reuse a component in a new product, an existing component in a new product, if the component is in-house, right, then whatever modifications need to be made to that component for reuse in a new product, firms need to bear that cost internally. So there's an internal bearing of costs there. All costs are going to be borne by the firm, right? So if the costs are going to be very high, all those costs need to be borne because it's an in-house component. Whereas if it's a third-party component, a firm will share the cost, at least partially, of modifications for reuse of components. But reuse also creates a risk. And the risk is that a firm runs the risk of entrenching the third party or giving the third party more power. Because what happens is now a firm is using a particular third party component in its existing product, then it starts using the third party component in a new product, right? And doing that increases the power of the third party, that is the entity that is outside of the firm. And that is a strategic risk, because what may happen is that in the future, these third parties may become if they become very influential and very strong, they may extract the rents from the firm, right? It can cause a hold up problem, and that's what transaction cost theory would predict, right? So if you think about these aspects, you can come to the conclusion that in-house additive components are probably going to be more useful when expertise in the existing architecture is important, because in-house additive components, they strengthen their knowledge of the existing architecture. They'll also be going, they'll probably be more useful when the costs of reuse of additive components, in-house additive components, are going to be lower, right, as opposed to higher, right? So when the opportunity remains viable, even with these higher internal costs, then firms may do well to use in-house components. On the flip side, if knowledge of other architectures is important, right, and then third-party components are likely to be useful. But if, like I said, even though this may reduce costs, if there is a threat of entrenching the existing third party, firms may still not do it because they may not want to give power to the third party. However, if there is an opportunity in which they can use third-party additive components without entrenching third parties or reducing the risk of third parties, at that time, third-party additive components are going to probably be more helpful, right? And now, by now, probably you can see where I'm going with this, what these arguments are suggesting. So these arguments are suggesting that in-house and third-party components will affect diversification differently. And how will they affect differently is that in-house components, because they're going to be important where a knowledge of existing architecture is important, and firms will need to bear the costs internally. Wherever diversification is within the architecture, in-house components are likely going to be important, because the internal costs are going to be lower when within the existing architecture, because we know that architectural shifts are very costly from research, right? So if firms produce products within the existing architecture, then the costs are lower. And those costs can then be borne. It makes sense for a firm to bear those costs, right? So H1 predicts that the stock of in-house component will affect within, whereas across architectures, third-party components will influence diversification across architectures, right? So that's the basic, these are the fundamental two hypotheses we have. Now, yes, there's a question, I suppose.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, these two hypotheses would work depending on two things. One is how much asset specificity the third party component has, and how central that component is to the new product that one is going to offer, right? So those two things do not get reflected here. And the third thing, if you want to use the knowledge-based theory, it will be how far away the knowledge of the existing component is from what you're trying to.
Okay. Absolutely.
So those nuances get lost here in some sense. So I don't know, how do you capture that later?
Okay. So first of all, thank you. And those are excellent points. And let me sort of try and address them with starting from the last one. In fact, what you were alluding to is about the knowledge, about knowledge overlap, and that is precisely our third hypothesis. And the third hypothesis is that a knowledge overlap between in-house and third-party components will reduce the influence of third-party components. So this, I suppose, goes to what you were talking about, the knowledge implications, right? So this is sort of a direct test. In fact, we do offer this test that between third-party and in-house additive components, if there is an overlap, that should actually reduce the third-party influence of third parties. I think the other point that you very rightly made was, what about the asset specificity? And this is the way I think about it. You're right. If there is the higher the asset specificity, that's going to lead to certain threats, right? And the threat may be more if it's a very specific thing. We're going to be looking at vendor-specific apps. So we're not going to be looking at generic apps. So in this case, the complementarity between the external additive components and the firm's product is going to be fairly reasonably high. Probably, and that when I come to the empirics, that will give you a sense. But I think you're absolutely spot on that this will not apply to generic sort of additive components. And that's actually a boundary condition for our arguments. So thank you. I hope I answered, but we can.
I'll come back to it once.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, like I said, so H3 suggests that the knowledge overlap between third-party and in-house will reduce the influence of third-party additive components. And till now, what we've been looking at is the effect of in-house and on within and third-party on across. And if our reasoning and the logic is right, and for stronger internal validity or inconsistent arguments, we should also be predicting the effects of in-house on across and third-party on within, right? And that's what we do. And so these comparative effects, we should find weaker effects. And I think this also goes back to a little bit of what you were saying, but this is more of a comparative comparison test. So the effect of in-house should weaken across, should be more for within as compared to across, whereas the effects of third-party should be weaker for within and more seen in across, right? So this is our prediction. Just to let you know, we find we don't get we find most of these except for the effect of third-party on within, and we think it's because it's a particular reason which I will talk about later. It's an empirical reason, I think, which relates to our context. Okay. So, and like I said earlier, I started by saying that the stock of components could affect diversification, but diversification could also affect the incentives for in further investments in additive components, right? And if you remember earlier, I said that across architectures, firms have a lower threat of entrenching third parties, because if you change architectures, then even the third parties need to change. It imposes costs on them. So that gives an opportunity for newer third parties to enter. And because of that, because the threat of entrenchment is then lowered when a firm diversifies across architectures, it can depend on the market for third-party components and reduce its own investments in in-house additive components. So the fifth hypothesis is that when there is diversification across architectures, it reduces the flow of in-house additive components in the subsequent period, right? So that's the complete model. Okay. Let me quickly, so this is a quick overview of the theory. Let me talk about the empirics and the empirical context, because and that may probably help in answering a few of the questions. Okay, so we test our arguments, like I said, in the context of product diversification by Android smartphone vendors. So Android, as some of you may know, is an operating system that is an open source operating system. So different smartphone vendors can use the Android platform. So the data that we collect is from official Google data. We collect information on the Android devices that are supported by Google. So that's on the device side. On the additive component side, we collect information on apps, mobile apps. Because apps, let me talk about apps a little bit and then come back here. Apps are important additive components for smartphones. Like I said, it depends. So we all know that we don't just purchase a smartphone. You know, some of us may use it only for calling, but many of us want to use these apps, and we want to use apps that we like, right? So apps are important additive components. Let's take an example of Samsung. Samsung has an app called Samsung Knox. Now, this is an in-house app, right? So that's an example of an in-house app that is there in our data. But Samsung also has had this, you know, Spotify, which is another app, works with Samsung. And it's a third party that is providing apps specifically for Samsung Galaxy phones. So a particular vendor can have vendor-specific apps that are provided by third parties, or it can also have in-house apps, right? Now, in the case of Samsung, it's very interesting. In the case of music, Samsung invested in an in-house app called Milk Music sometime. But over time, it divested this Milk Music, right? Remember, one of our hypotheses was that diversification across architectures lead to lower investments in in-house additive components. So this is just showing that over time, this is one example, Samsung is divesting of this, it sold the Milk Music app, right? So apps are important additive components. How do we collect these apps? We developed a proprietary algorithm to crawl Google Play and to extract vendor-specific apps. So these are not generic apps. These are not apps like Google Maps or Angry Birds that work on every device. These are apps that are specifically meant to work on certain devices. So Samsung Knox is an in-house app made by Samsung for Samsung phones. Samsung with Spotify, that's just an example. It was made for Samsung phones. And so vendor-specific apps. And then we match this device information to the app information in the period from 2010 to 2018. So there are around 41 smartphone vendors. These are all the major vendors in the world. And this is a global industry. So these vendors belong to 12 countries, from Canada to China and all over the world. I think India is there in as well. I think Micromax, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are around 14,000 devices and around 2,000 apps. And then we distinguish them into in-house and third-party. And for the Android devices, so the Android platform, it supports not just smartphones, it also supports tablets, smartwatches, so on and so forth. So we also distinguish the devices, right? Whether it's within the smartphone architecture or outside the smartphone architecture. Now, just
Siddharth, I think Professor Basant has one more.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, and one clarificatory question: are you able to figure out whether these third-party apps are co-specialized kinds of apps where the vendor also has to make some changes? It's basically specialized, which are only so the asset specificity works in different ways, right? In these two kind of situations.
Yeah,
so if you have co-invested or co-specialized apps, then the vendor also has something to lose. Otherwise, it's basically the app provider who has to pay. So that would make a difference to your overall argument, right? I mean,
I think that's a good point. Who is making these investments? Honestly, that information is not there, but probably I'll have to go back and look at whether we can create some sort of an indicator of which apps may be co-specialized depending on the category of the app. So that could be, but thank you for that.
Because the idea of opportunistic behavior would work in different ways, right? In the two situations.
Yes, I agree. And I think there is some value in looking at that, that distinguishing between co-specialization and specialization. So thank you for that. I think that's a nice comment. Thank you. So in the data, we see rapid development, as one would expect, in Android apps and devices. Exponential rise in devices. Interestingly, the number of third-party apps go up, right? The exponential rise in third-party apps and in in-house apps. But I want to call your attention to the number of other Android devices. You see, it actually goes down over time, which means that many vendors are actually reducing diversification across architectures for some reason. And some vendors may be increasing, so there could be variation across vendors, but generally the industry tended to reduce over time. Whereas of course, the number of Android smartphones went up. And this is pretty consistent with what one may expect in this industry. Okay. Very quickly, let me just talk about how we measure product diversification, and then a quick insight into the results, and then I'll talk about the implications so that then we can get any.
Siddharth, one more question.
No, once again, a clarificatory question. Are you standardizing these number of vendor apps by the number of vendors, or?
So no, these, so this is just the raw data that
Raw data, because if there's consolidation, number of vendors are declining, you may see that.
No, that's a good point. In this, what happens is some vendors enter after 2010.
Okay.
So there are probably more vendors in the period between 2015 to 2018.
Okay.
So the entry happens at fewer later periods, but this is just the raw information.
Yeah. So then the vendor age would come into play. And anyway, it's a very interesting data.
Okay. Thank you. So we measure diversification within architecture. So I won't go into the details of the measure. We can have a conversation around that. But this is the Shannon Diversity Index, where within architecture we look at diversification within smartphones across different price segments. And price segments are defined in increments of $250 for the main results. We also have sensitivity checks where we change the segments for diversification within architecture. But importantly, this is diversification within smartphones. So is a vendor moving into different smartphone price segment categories, diversifying across there. And of course, diversification across architectures is the vendor also doing tablets? Are they doing watches? Are they doing other forms of devices that come? And the index is the same. It's called Shannon Entropy Index. Okay. To measure the stocks and flows of apps, it's the stock is the total number of apps in a given year, total number of apps launched by the vendor, by the product smartphone vendor since 2010 on Google Play. Or it could be, if it's a third party, then it's vendor-specific apps launched from 2010 until that particular year. So, and flow of apps is measured for a particular year. It's just the number of new Android applications launched by the vendor or by third parties in a given year. In sensitivity, we also vary the time periods for the stock. So very quickly to show you the sort of controls we have. We have different measures for firm capabilities and strategy. This is knowledge overlap is one that I spoke about. Portfolio size is the vendor doing lots of devices or fewer devices. Capabilities for product innovation is how many important feature improvements has the vendor introduced since its entry into the smartphone market. Competition is the smartphones launched by rivals. Previous presence outside smartphones is in the past, what percentage of its portfolio was outside smartphones, right? And similarly in price segments, just to control for past effects.
Okay, and there is one question, I think.
Sorry, once again, a minor one. Typically, a stock is cumulative stock, right? All the three definitions of both the definitions of stock are something introduced in a particular year. To me, those are flows.
Oh, I'm sorry. Both are cumulative. I'm sorry if I didn't.
Yeah. So it's
cumulative.
It's launched by a vendor just since 2010. Okay. Sorry, my bad.
Okay. No worries. So it's these are both cumulative measures. Okay. So for estimations, we use OLS firm fixed effects. I don't want to go into specifics of the model given the time we have, but we control for firm fixed effects. So we sort of take out, is a firm Japanese or is it Korean? Those effects are taken out. Just to quickly show you the results. So stock of in-house apps increases diversification within architecture. That's what we predicted. And the stock of third-party apps also increases diversification across architectures. And but if there is a knowledge overlap, then the effect is reduced. So that's what we predicted in H1, 2, and 3. And H4 was the comparative effects, and we find we do find H1, H4A, H4B we don't, because we think that third-party apps mean perhaps in this it has to do with a little bit of the empirical context. Let me come to that after the sensitivity checks and show you H5. H5, we predicted that across architecture, diversification reduces the flow of in-house apps. Now, the statistical significance of this is not too high because the dependent variable here is actually a count variable, and we're using an OLS model. Typically, that's not useful. One should use a count variable model. So we just wanted to show all models similarly in the main results, but in sensitivity checks, we use negative binomial models. In fact, we see much stronger results when we account for model, when we change the estimated model. Okay, there are some concerns. There may be some questions about, are these firms owning platforms beyond Android, like Samsung and BlackBerry is also an Android for comes into Android later. What are those effects? We drop those firms. The results seem to hold. Okay, very quickly, I just want to talk about the implications because we have 15 minutes left, and I want to give a few minutes for question and answers. So what's the main contribution that we think? Well, it's to the interface between knowledge-based theory and transaction costs, specifically the joint role that knowledge and transaction costs play for path dependency in new product development. So as applied to new product development, what is the joint role? And the insight here is that there may be heterogeneous effects depending on the nature of diversification. So in-house versus third party are going to have different effects depending on whether it's going to be diversification within or across. Right? That's one. The other is the temporal dynamics. Like I said, diversification, product diversification being influenced by component stocks. This is a general idea that exists in the literature, and there are some papers around it. So we do show that. Importantly, we also show that diversification affects the flow of components. And so the model that we have is an integrated model. So stocks, diversification, and flows together in one. I haven't come across too many papers that test these dynamics empirically. And we think that that sort of contributes to our understanding of how new product development pans out over time. So so this is the theoretical implication for us. What are the empirical implications? There is a phenomenon called as the Galapagos Syndrome for Japanese phones. And the idea is that, why these big companies like NEC and Panasonic, they seem to do very well in Japan, but outside of Japan, they seem to be very weak in launching new products like tablets and smartwatches, and so on and so forth. For example, contrast them to the Chinese manufacturers like Xiaomi or Huawei, where the Chinese manufacturers have done very well, but Japanese manufacturers, even though they have strong technical capabilities, they don't seem to be, they don't seem to have done that too well. So the question is there a role of in-house versus third-party apps? And if we go back to our data, so if I cut the data and look at just the Japanese firms, what I observe is that they have very strong stocks of in-house apps, but very poor access to third-party apps. Whereas in Chinese manufacturers, they do have a substantial, or even Samsung, for example, substantial access to third-party apps. So therefore, that may play a role in the path dependency in product development. So it's not that these manufacturers have poor technical capabilities. It's just that their stocks of additive components are probably pushing them in one particular direction. That's what I certainly think that explains a bit of the Galapagos syndrome. Okay, so what do these things mean for managers? We teach this in class. If there was something that we would take in our MBA or our executive MBA, what do we tell our students? Well, I think what it means for managers is that one is that third-party components, they are important for diversification. So even if they are less important today in your current market where you're competing with other firms, you seem to be doing very well. So they may be less important in your existing market, but they may play an important role in facilitating diversification across different architectures. Right. And I think that's the important thing. It's not just today's market, it's how does your future diversification pan out. Therefore, in the regular product planning that managers do, they should probably, they would be well off assessing what the diversification goals for their firm is, and then considering what their stocks of additive components are in terms of in-house versus third party. Certainly, if a firm just wants to stick within their existing architecture, maybe they're well off building their stocks of in-house apps. And that in-house additive components, and that may be okay. But if the firm aspires to move across different architectures, even if third-party components are not very important in their existing market, they may be important for diversification. Right? So that was my quick thing. Of course, there are many promising contexts for uncovering these sort of dynamics of business expansion. Many places where there are no apps. I'm particularly interested in this tension between the rigid bank structures and fintech, and how that affects the expansion of banks and of fintech. So there are some other papers that I'm working on, and I invite you to join research in this area. I'll be happy to discuss these things. And thank you very much. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them now.
I will start with one.
Okay.
So I think this is very useful study, and the heterogeneity part of it was very informative. So if you go back to your model, perhaps.
Okay, this is the full model.
Yeah, this is the full model. So what is the kind of there is a knowledge overlap, and this affects the third party versus the path of third party to across architectures. Did you also test it with in-house and within architecture, or what is the influence on that one?
Yeah, so we did see, in fact, it's there in the model, and I can show you.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
It's there in the empirical model. We don't directly hypothesize it, because so we see that if it is diversification within smartphones, there's no real effect on either the flow of in-house apps or third-party apps. Now this I'm not sure why there aren't any effects. Perhaps this is because they already have stocks of in-house apps. What we do see is that if they have strong stocks of in-house apps, it reduces the flow, which is quite intuitive, right? So if you already have a big stock, maybe you reduce your flow. So, but we didn't theorize it
upfront.
As a separate hypothesis, because we thought we couldn't get a clear logic that fits within this framework.
I see.
Yeah, thank you, Neha.
Can you, I missed the definition of the knowledge overlap. How did you measure that? Oh,
I don't know. Maybe I went very quickly. Okay, so knowledge, okay, I don't think I put it up there. It's knowledge overlap is a binary variable. It's set to 1 if the vendor has third party and in-house apps in the same category. So by the category. So Google Play actually gives you the category that the app belongs to. So if you have a messaging app and you also have a third party app, which is also in messaging, there's going to be a knowledge overlap there, because essentially the apps do perform the same sort of function for the end user. So we measure it by the presence of the same category for in-house and third-party apps.
Okay, so then knowledge overlap is essentially driven by the functionality, not right. necessarily the underlying logic, knowledge of.
It's driven
because the effect size in your first estimation, the effect size of knowledge lab is very high. And if you look at the size, go to your first, see it is very high. The other one, you just here, the knowledge overlap H3 is the size of the effect is very high.
Right.
And it's a dummy, you were saying, right? It's
a dummy variable. So it's so the question is there a knowledge overlap or not? So if there is a knowledge overlap, then there is a big drop in the effect of third party. Yeah. So I think we did test it even as a continuous variable. Of course, I think with the continuous variable, the effect size drops a bit. But this is just a 0, 1 variable.
Interesting. The size is so large. I mean, I was thinking whether it's possible to look at patent stocks.
Well, yeah, that's a. Let me talk about patent stocks, and you're right. I tried to do patent stocks. The thing is, in this particular industry, the mobile smartphone manufacturing, it turns out that you really don't need a large stock of patents.
That's true. That's true.
So, I mean, in some other research, I actually find that patenting by smartphone manufacturers actually goes down over time. Which means that the technical knowledge of maybe of communications technology, etc., that's not really driving innovation. It's more the knowledge of from a customer perspective. What are the needs of the customer?
That's true. I mean, in this space, patenting intensity is much lower. But whatever. The other thought that so I talked about specialized and co-specialized kind of situations. The other thing which might affect the strategy of internalizing or using outside could be the market power. If you already have country level fixed effects, right? You have controlling.
You have firm level fixed effects. So if it's Samsung, then Samsung is controlled for. So if they but I mean, it could change over time.
I was just wondering that if Samsung faces more competition as compared to another vendor, whether that, I don't know. I don't know how to capture that, but because if you go back the earlier kind of studies and say, okay, gave power to Intel or Microsoft and you lost the game.
Right.
So how important these app providers are in the overall scheme of things.
Right.
If they are not, then I will not really worry about the minor asset specificity problem that I am dealing with. So.
Right. It's yeah. For the they are important for the platform for Google Play itself. But whether they take off the rents as yet for Samsung and I mean, that's still a bit, because they don't really have control directly. They don't directly control. I mean, they can prevent. It's like Apple controls everything, so they can off apps, but that's a completely closed system. Yeah.
The Android applications, I mean, Google and some other players own a large number of patents around Android.
Right.
It is much more open, but it's still a kind of a ecosystem, right? Which it's still and different players may have different kinds of control over the ecosystem.
Right. So so what we are looking at is within platform. So there are two kinds of competition: between platform competition and within platform. So in the literature, they talk about competition between Apple and Google. So that's between platform. This is within platform. So within a platform, how do the complementers compete with each other?
Right.
These are all they're just using the platform and they're complementers and they're competing. Right. So I think. But that would certainly be a boundary for some of the things, some of the predictions.
So that's what I had in mind. So the competition between complementers and competition between these vendors might affect these choices. I mean, earlier today I was reading a paper by Gar in Research Policy on these platforms itself.
Right. Yes. Yes. So it's. I mean, I've tried to we've tried to frame it apart from the platform literature because there are different kinds of dynamics that happen there. And this is more, they talk about network effects and things like that.
Right.
But these are all the firms here have the same have access to the same platform. So that's the point.
Sure.
So.
No, very interesting. I mean, I teach a course here called Economics of Strategy, and I sort of pull together different theories and
Right.
focus on the complementarities. And as you said, very few studies actually empirically test those complementarities.
Right. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
for your observations. I think they are, and some of them I'm going to look into the data, whether we can push it a bit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Siddharth. I think this is coming to an end. This, very intriguing session. I like the way you have analyzed data and, the whole putting in perspective from two theories, the integrative view. So that was very interesting to know. So audience, if you would like to connect with Siddharth, please feel free to do so offline. If you would like to know more about his research, or if you want to collaborate with him, please feel free to do so. And for this session, thank you so much, Siddharth, and sharing your research with us. This is ongoing research. So I wish you the very best, and thank you so much for your feedback and comments, Professor Basant. That was also very informative, and sharing your thoughts on the project. And I wish everyone a very a fruitful evening to have. We end this session here.
Okay.
So thank you so much. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you for all, Professor Basant, for your comments. They've been extremely helpful. And I certainly hope that when the pandemic is behind us, we'll be able to meet more face to face. So thank you very much.
Once you finalize the paper, I would love to read it. So
absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we will love to have you here, Siddharth. We love to host you here.
It's been a long time since I
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Siddharth.
Bye-bye.
And yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.